Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first Expertise episode. We've been walking through Genesis 1 and 2 lately, looking at the goodness of creation and the image of God, and exploring how male and female both matter equally to that image, and also combating latent Gnosticism by discussing the importance of bodies to who we are. One of my favorite scholars, Dr. Carmen Imes, has written quite extensively about all those topics, so I invited her to tea, so to speak. In this episode, we cover a lot of ground, and there are some really fascinating ideas we explore on the issue of disability, trauma, and the difficulty of the Old Testament. I am very proud of this episode, very humbled and honored to have Dr. Imes as the very first guest on my podcast, and I am thrilled to share it with you all today. So, without further ado, here we go. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Church Kid podcast, where we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. Today, we're having our very first Expertise episode, and the expert we are inviting to tea, so to speak, is one of my favorite scholars to read and learn from, Dr. Carmen Imes. Dr. Imes, welcome.
Thank you. I'm honored to be your first one.
Yeah, I know.
That's great.
I'm breaking new ground here, and I love that I get to do that with you. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
My pleasure.
Yeah, because I had run across you interacting at first in the Tim Mackey discussion group, and that's when I first picked up your first book, Bearing God's Name, and that one just grabbed me completely. It was like, okay, this is like a really good balance of both scholarly information and also very accessible presentation. And so that's why you have become one of my favorites. So,
well, that's cool.
And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we spent some time talking about today was your second book, in that that's the follow-up to Bearing God's Name, Being God's Image. And I'm going to do my best to make sure that I always say bearing and being correctly.
I've made it very difficult for everyone by having such similar titles.
Well, I actually kind of like the synergy and the connection. Partly is just for me, as having 10 years as an educator in my background, I love alliteration, and it just helps to remember things. So, but it's fascinating because I've just personally kind of come to see him as almost like a sort of like Christological trilogy, where you have bearing God's name, because I know that there are several points where it talks about the angel of the Lord will go along with Israel, and that the Israelites must respond to him well, or else there'll be big problems because my name is in him. And then, of course, being God's image, Paul talks very often about Christ being the exact image of God. And then your third book that you're coming out with has a lot of parallels and connections to that as well, because it's about becoming God's family. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in which we become the body of Christ. So.
Yes. Yeah, I'm super excited and looking forward to being able to read that for sure.
Nice. I'm excited for it to see the world. It's something I've been thinking about for a number of years, just that we often in the West view Christianity as a solo journey. It's my religion's between me and God, and we miss out on the fact that we're being invited to become part of a family. And that should actually change everything about the way we live our lives now. So excited for that, to start conversations.
That was definitely one of the things that really struck me as I started to try to picture an overarching theme for the entire scriptures, is that idea of family, God's family.
Yeah. So,
well, before we dive too deep into things, I want to make sure that I give you a chance to introduce yourself for anybody who may not know you.
Sure.
But so before we get started, can you please introduce some of the podcast listeners to yourself and to your ministry?
Yeah, so as Spencer said, my name's Carmen Imes. I am Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University at Talbot School of Theology. That's in Southern California. So I live close enough to Disneyland to hear the fireworks at night. And so we're right here kind of in the heart of the entertainment industry, helping students to think about what does it mean to walk well with Jesus and to bear God's name well as we pursue excellence in lots of different areas of life, lots of different career trajectories. I love the Old Testament. I have always loved it since childhood, and I'm so delighted that I found a line of work that allows me to dig into it every day and try to understand more. I love helping the church tap into the Old Testament as a source of inspiration and relevance for the Christian life today. And so I like to linger on the weird passages to help people understand what they're doing there. I love to think about the big ideas that connect the Old and New Testament together. People can find me on YouTube. I have a weekly YouTube series called Torah Tuesday, like 10-minute-ish videos mostly on Exodus that I'm releasing as I work on a commentary on Exodus. And I write for Christianity Today, the Politics of Scripture blog, The Well. I've got stuff kind of here, there, and everywhere. So
awesome. Well, and it's interesting hearing you say that you've loved the Old Testament ever since you were younger. That's definitely not been my experience. Growing up Protestant, there was very much almost like a sense of kind of like the Old Testament was a bunch of stories, and I didn't really have a clear sense of how they were connected. And then when I started to become more aware of the Old Testament, I started to become more aware of, I know you called it weird. And that is absolutely one word for it, for some of the stories in there.
Yeah.
There are plenty of others that have a lot of weight that can cause some experiences of trauma and,
yes.
And can really be triggering for a lot of people.
So true.
So I was curious, how do you encounter that in the classroom when you are teaching the Old Testament with your students?
Yeah, I think what we have to recognize is that everyone brings their whole selves to the classroom or to the congregation. If we're talking about a sermon in church, that we're embodied and that our bodies carry with us our histories and what we have done and what has been done to us, experiences we've had, whether wanted or unwanted. And it's very difficult for us to hear biblical stories without reading our lives through those lenses. And that's okay. And that's normal. And often we teach the Bible in ways that doesn't acknowledge that. And so we don't realize that a story might be triggering for someone. This is not, sometimes there's pushback to the idea of talking about trauma as though everybody's a snowflake and we can't everybody's too hypersensitive. I don't think that's what this is about. I think it's about recognizing that the bodies God gave us keep the score. They keep a record of the traumas that have happened to us. And so we, if we want to communicate well, we need to acknowledge what people are bringing with them potentially into the room. And so in the classroom, one of the things that I try to do is warn students ahead of time if they're going to encounter content that could be triggering. If somebody's a victim of sexual abuse, then reading the end of Judges might be really rough for them. Absolutely. Because there's a story of egregious sexual abuse and violence. And I think people struggle with the Bible often because they expect that it's just a flat record of what God wants us to do. And then when you encounter a story where people are doing things that feel really wrong, then we don't know what to do with it. And sometimes people who are not understanding what it is they're reading will think, oh, is God okay with this? Why is this in the Bible? This horrific scene makes it seem like, I guess God's okay with this. When in fact, the point of the end of Judges is to show us the degree to which the nation of Israel had spiraled downward and fallen from the way God wanted them to live. So we are supposed to be horrified by what happened because God is horrified by what happened. The narrator doesn't stick his face into the story very often and tell us how we're supposed to feel about things that are happening. The narrator thinks this is obvious because we've already read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy before we got to Judges. And so we should already know what God expects of his people, and we can see that they're failing at every turn. And so for me, one of the more important things that I can do with students is to show them how we should feel and respond as we're reading a story. So when we get to Judges, I actually spend most of a class period on the ending of Judges, and we read it verse by verse together. but I warn them, the class, ahead of time. I say, in the previous section of the class, I say, okay, we're going to be reading a story together. That's a really difficult one. It includes violence and sexual assault. And I just wanted you to know that ahead of time. And if you think that might be triggering for you, I would invite you to join class on Zoom next time instead of coming in person. Because there are some people who are afraid to walk into that situation because they don't know. We don't have control over when we're going to start having a panic attack or hyperventilating or even just like heart palpitations or whatever. And it can be very scary to be in a situation where you feel like I can't leave and everybody can see that I'm struggling with this. And so on that particular day, I allow students to join on Zoom and they don't have to turn on their camera. I encourage them, even if you think this might be triggering, please join us on Zoom, because I really think it's going to be important for you to hear this story through the lenses of how the Spirit is inviting us to respond to it. So then I read it really slowly and carefully. I allow myself to emotionally react. I usually get teared up. I usually stop. And I just like let them know if I'm feeling nauseous, just noticing like how this is impacting my body and that's okay, that we should feel really disturbed by this story. That's what the narrator wants us to do. The narrator wants us to see this is a problem. Something needs to be done about it. And so just walking with students through that and showing them how to process it, but not springing it on them. I think that's the key. Is if we want to walk people through hard texts, don't just like throw it in there without a warning. Let them know, hey, next class, we're going to be reading a story. We're going to be talking for a few minutes about the story of David and Bathsheba. And this can be a tricky one because it involves a sexual encounter that people sometimes argue about whether the victim was complicit in what happened. And so I have some thoughts on that, and I think we need to talk about it, but I just wanted you to know it's coming. So those are some examples.
Oh my goodness. I just love that approach that acknowledges our embodiedness and the reactions of our body. And I don't know if that was an intentional Bessel van der Kolk reference there.
It was.
Yeah. With the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
But I know that is kind of not, I don't want to say novel necessarily, but it's a little bit unusual. Just because I know growing up, I was always kind of taught that if you have the discomfort about these things, then here's the cognitive explanation for it. Here's the kind of logical reason for why it all makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's, it was never explicitly stated, but there was kind of an expectation of that's supposed to solve the problem.
Well, and there's this idea like this is the Bible. We're supposed to like it.
Right.
We're supposed to devote our lives to it. So if it makes me feel uncomfortable, then I'm the problem.
Right.
And in fact, there are things in the Bible that are designed to make us feel uncomfortable. So when we do, we're actually reading it well. Instead of trying to shut down those responses, we should sit with them and say, why is this bothering me? Well, it's bothering me because this is wrong. What these people are doing in the story is wrong. And when we react to it, we're actually sharing God's heart towards the situation. So instead of shutting ourselves down, we should open ourselves to that and ask the Lord to show us where he is in the story, what he's trying to say to us through it. There are some other ways that I've tried to do this in the classroom, like in a moment of intensity in the text, I might just stop and take a deep breath and encourage everybody, like, put your feet flat on the floor, take a deep breath in through your nose, out through your mouth, like just reminding people that they're physically present in this room, like you are safe here. One of the keys, I'm not a psychologist, but one of the keys to overcoming a trauma response is just to become present in our bodies in this place again, like focus on breathing, focus on what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? And so sometimes I'll weave that into a class conversation if we're reading something intense, or I'll just stop and acknowledge this is intense. And for some of us in this room, this might be intense, more intense than for others because of the experiences we bring with us into the classroom.
No, you're absolutely right. Peter Levine, one of the major trauma figures in the trauma world, has said that trauma is a disorder of not being able to be in the here and now.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that makes an awful lot of sense of what you're saying of trying to ground ourselves in the here and now. And
Yeah.
I would certainly encourage anybody, as we're going through the podcast, as we're looking at parts of the Bible, if there is any part of that that feels very difficult for you,
hmm
to start, just take a sec. It's okay to close your Bible and walk away for a while.
Yeah.
That's
It is.
fine.
It
And
is.
to remind yourself that I'm at home, I'm safe, I'm not back then, I'm not
Yep.
there, I'm not with them.
Yep.
And I'm instead maybe invite the loving Father into that
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. There's some other ways that I've tried to walk with students well in this realm. I invite them to come talk to me if this has brought stuff up
Yeah.
for them and they want to process it more. They're welcome to come see
Good.
me during office hours, or if I'm available after class. I give them permission to leave class. If this story just gets to be too much for you and you need to like take a walk and get some fresh air and reset, you're welcome to do that. And then I've had students before who struggle with reading, and sometimes I recommend listening to the Bible on audiobook. But I have had students, particularly female students, who were victims of male sexual assault, who have a very difficult time listening to a man read the Bible to them, because there's an especially if there was a religious dimension to their abuse.
Oh gosh, yes.
That association is just too strong. And so one of the resources that I like to tell students about is I think it's called the She version. There's an audio Bible that's all read by women. And so if a male voice is triggering for you, go listen to a woman read it. Now that doesn't always solve it for everyone. Sometimes women are involved in covering of abuse or something, and that also can be triggering. But just letting students know that there are different ways to engage scripture. There's not a one size fits all. And sometimes students have a hard time hearing the Bible and receiving it if they've had especially some kind of religious trauma in the past. And so I've encouraged them, listen to the Bible with a woman reading it while you're on a walk in the morning. Don't do it at night, right before bed, as you're tired and your defenses are down. Like, find a time when you can see other people around you, when you can be reminded you're in a safe space, or read it with somebody or whatever. Anyway, there's a lot of possible ways of engaging scripture. There's not just one way.
Right. Well, and that emphasis on us being embodied creatures is so critical to what you wrote about in your book about being God's image. So the past podcast episodes, we focused on Genesis 1-2, and we've talked an awful lot about the image of God. So in your books, you made a distinction between people bearing God's image and being God's image.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that and why that matters?
It's very common for people to talk about bearing God's image or imaging God. People like to turn image into a verb, and and I think that people who are saying these things are not crazy. This is like, there's a long tradition behind it, but I respectfully have pushed in another direction. I think that actually we don't bear the image of God. We are the image of God. And when you talk about bearing or carrying something, that's something you can set down or walk away from. And I think the Bible's very clear that every human being is the image of God, and there's nothing that we can do to divest ourselves of that status and identity. It's God-given. We didn't choose it. We can't set it down and walk away. So that's why I'm very particular about talking about being God's image, or God made us as his image, rather than turning it into a verb, which makes it something we do and could stop doing, or something we carry and could stop carrying.
Right. Yeah, and I have encountered some theological perspectives that try to take the point of view that we lost the image at some point, in the fall.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I kind of identified something different.
Yeah, that's also a common perspective, that the image was lost, or at least diminished or marred in some way at the fall. Let me be clear that I think whatever happened in Genesis 3 was really bad, and that there were things that were lost. But I don't think that we can make a good exegetical case for the image being lost. And that's the reason for that is if you turn to chapter 5 of Genesis, it begins talking again about the image of God. Sometimes people turn to Genesis 5 as proof that the image was lost because it talks about Adam being made in the likeness of God, but Adam's son Seth is made in Adam's likeness and in Adam's image. And so they conclude from that, oh yeah, Seth isn't the image of God, even though that's not what it says. And I don't think that's what's being implied, because if you keep going to Genesis 9, after the flood, God speaks to Noah about the value on human life. The reason that humans aren't allowed to go around taking their revenge out on each other by killing each other is because humans are God's image. And so the image of God is the basis for human ethics after the fall, which is also after the flood. After the flood, which is also after the fall. So I don't think, that's, I think, tutoring us in how to understand what's going on in chapter 5. It's not that Seth isn't the image of God. It's that Seth is also the image of his human father, which tells us something about what it means to be God's image. It's indicating that we're part of God's royal family. We have that same father, son, daughter likeness that Adam and Seth do. Seth is not Adam. We're not God. We're God's image. And that's one of the things that people get kind of worried about when you start playing around with the pronouns of how to describe the image of God. Are we in the image or as the image? They want to emphasize there's distance between us and God. Well, yes, we're God's image. We're not God. That's already as much distance as we need.
So with that word image, that's not something that we encounter too much outside of the biblical narrative in the way in which you've been describing it. So I'm curious, what is the relationship between image and idol in the A&E world?
Yes. I think that's a really important question to ask, because when we hear image, we think of something you see in a mirror, which is a two-dimensional reflection.
Right.
Or we think about a metaphor, like we'll talk about our public image. And what we mean by that is something like our brand. What is Carmen Imes all about? Well, she's really into the Old Testament and she does biblical theology and she's on a lot of podcasts. So that's my brand. Is that my image? That is not what this word means. In Hebrew, the word tselem is the word for an idol. And so in any ancient Near Eastern temple, there's a tselem in the most holy place that represents three-dimensionally the presence of that deity. It isn't the deity. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew the idol was not the deity, but the idol represented the presence of the deity in a very embodied way, like three-dimensionally. And so I think this is probably the most neglected aspect of the biblical teaching that humans are God's image, is that it's our bodies that qualify us to be the image of God. We are three-dimensional beings, and so we can be seen and touched when God cannot be seen and touched. And so he appoints us in the place of an idol. He doesn't want idols. He's chosen us to be the ones that point to his presence in the world.
So when we're plucking ideas from that ancient Near East context, obviously there's always continuities and discontinuities there. So I'm curious, how is that idea of humans as the Tselem of Adonai, how is that both the same and different from the way that the ancient Near East culture viewed their own ideas of Tselem?
Yeah. Well, it's the same in that we're also most images, most idols had some sort of anthropomorphic characters or qualities, like a body. It might have been an animal body or a human body. There's a three-dimensional representation, usually of a living being of some kind, but it wasn't living. And that's where the discontinuity comes in. Humans are alive. And it's as if God says, I can't be represented by something that's inanimate. I'm going to have a living image because that's going to more faithfully represent my presence. The other discontinuity is that there are so many of us, that there's a kind of democratization of representation.
Yeah.
Instead of just one idol in each temple, or just a handful of authorized representatives, every human being is the image of God, which enables God's presence to be more universally experienced and felt.
Mm-hmm.
And it also puts us on par with one another. There's a parity between humans that is different, because in the ancient world, they sometimes talked about kings being the image of God, as though the kings were the physical embodiment. So Egyptian kings, Egyptian pharaohs were the physical embodiment. They believed themselves to be the physical embodiment of the sun god Ra.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so they ruled with Ra's authority, and they sort of aspired to be that physical embodiment. And then after they died, they believed that they would go through this process of becoming that god in the underworld as well. But that's only true of kings, not every human being. And so there's this beautiful democratization of the special status. It's now held by every human being.
That's so fascinating as a reflection of Adonai and his character, is that it tells us a couple of really important things. One is that he is no respecter of persons, great or small, or like he wants everybody to be a part of his royal family.
Yes.
But then also it does some really good work to be able to, I love what you said about being alive there. That was one of the key distinctions, is that Adonai is not somebody who's just sitting off away somewhere and kind of operating through an inanimate object. He's walking among us to a certain degree and with certain qualifications, kind of God with skin on.
And I think this is so important, just tying back to our previous discussion about trauma.
Yes.
So many traumas stem from exploitative relationships where one person seized power and abused others instead of treating them as fellow images of God, who are equally called to rule over creation. So if there's any kind of abuse, that's a violation of the order that God intended for creation, which is that we all work together to rule creation. And the asymmetry that leads to certain kinds of trauma is by definition out of God's plan.
Yes.
It just strikes me that the embodiment, because embodiment is a core piece of this idea of being God's image, that sometimes people who've experienced trauma have an uneasy relationship with their bodies.
Yep.
They would like to get rid of the sight of abuse. They would like to get rid of it. I mean, the idea of going to heaven when we die and just sort of shedding these bodies and being free of them is really appealing to someone who's been through physical trauma of some kind, or maybe even has scars or disabilities to show for it. Like it's thinking of like the trauma of a car crash and the loss of a limb or something. Like, I would really like to get rid of this body and get a new one.
And
so I think
of that.
I think it's really important for us to recognize that our bodies are essential to our personhood and our identity. And that somehow what will happen when we enter into the new creation is a healing of our bodies that retains continuity with the bodies we have now. There will be some kind of continuity. I cannot say with certainty what that will look like. Because we have a very limited sample size, and that would be Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus' resurrected body has scars from his crucifixion. So he did not shed his body and get a different one. Yeah. But he doesn't seem to be in pain in his new body. And he has these new capabilities like walking through walls. So I can't prove that you will either, if you lost your arm in a car crash, I can't prove that you will get your arm back or that you won't. Like I can't say with certainty either way. And it might not be one size fits all. It might not be that that all of our bodies have the same kind of transformation going into the new creation. There's some really interesting work being done on this topic by Maya Whitaker. Her first name is spelled Maja. I'm not for sure how to pronounce it. But the title of her dissertation is Perfect in Weakness. And she explores, it's kind of a thought experiment, exploration of diverse embodiment in the new creation. And she suggests that perhaps we won't all have the same kind of bodily transformation. And it will depend on whether something is essential to our sense of personhood or whether it isn't. So there are some people who feel like the disability that they have is part of who they are. And maybe those people will retain some degree of disability in that area in the new creation, but it won't be a barrier to community and flourishing like it is here. And other people might have a bodily disfigurement of some sort that they weren't born with, or that they doesn't feel like it's part of who they are. And maybe that will be gone. And I think this is a really fascinating thought experiment, not because we can ever be sure, but because it exposes the idolatry of our own hearts. Because so many of us think, if I just had a perfect body with no limitations, then all would be well. And when in fact, God designed us not to be independent and able to do everything without help, but he designed us to be interdependent. The problem was we don't work well together.
Yes.
We don't look out for each other's needs. So I think it's a really interesting thought experiment to consider whether disability is more about the harm to a community and our lack of working together versus an actual problem to be solved physically.
Yeah, and I love that image so much. Like I know I'm thinking specifically of one client I had who had some scars from some self-injury. And at one point, as part of the recovery process, they decided to get a tattoo on that space of their arm that wasn't to hide the scar, but actually incorporated it into like a tree trunk that was just gorgeous.
Nice.
And so it made this symbol of pain and trauma and hurt and loss become something else.
I love it.
That's kind of the picture that I have in my head when you describe that.
Yes, I do think, and this is, I touch on this idea very briefly in Being God's Image, and that's the part of the book that got the most pushback in the early readers, among early readers, people on the launch team who got to read the book before it came out. That was the thing. They came after me and they were like, wait, what? You're telling me I might still have this issue in the new creation? Like, no. I believe I'm going to be healed. And it's a little hard to talk about it without getting too so personal. It's like, it touches this core angst or longing that people have. And so I am not telling anyone out there with confidence that they will or won't have a disability in the new creation. I just think we need to be careful not to assume that the challenges we experience are in and of themselves problematic. So the example that pushed me in this direction was the story of Moses when God calls him to go to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. And Moses says, but I have this speech impediment. And I believe that what's going on there is not just stage fright, but he actually has a speech problem based on the way it's expressed in Hebrew. And God does not tell him, okay, I'll heal your speech impediment. He says, who made your mouth? And he in fact goes on to say, who made people, let me look it up so I can say it exactly. This is in Exodus chapter 4. I'm reading from the NIV.
I have a hard time not hearing it as the Prince of Egypt movie.
Sure, right. So who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. This kind of rocked my world because I had always thought of disability as a result of the fall.
Okay.
It's a result of sin in the world that some people are born with broken bodies. But this implies that God makes diverse embodiment on purpose, that he intentionally makes some people deaf, some people mute, some people sighted, and some people blind. And that was like, wait, have I been thinking about this all wrong?
Well, I know several of the people who I've worked with who have disabilities do not see, they don't see them as like, as being a negative thing or a detraction. They see it as being differently abled, as having
Yes.
other qualities that get to come out and shine.
And there are moments in the Bible, there's moments in the prophets that talk about kind of new creation, new covenant ideas where there will be eunuchs who serve as priests.
Right.
It's like, okay, so here's somebody with diverse sexual embodiment. This is somebody who's would normally not be allowed to be a priest because of bodily disfigurement that makes them unable to bear children, father children. And they are going to be priests, which means that sounds to me like people with disabilities will be fully included.
Yes.
Not God will make it so that everyone is an exact cookie cutter of the perfect human specimen, will all be the same.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of diverse bodies, you are at pains to mention in several of your published works about how male and female both equally and together are the image of God.
Yeah.
What does that mean? That's a really big question.
This is something I feel like is so profound if we could just grab onto this. Genesis 1:26 is telling us men and women are the image of God. Male and female are the image of God. And if embodiment is the qualification for imageness, then being female is not somehow second tier or less than. And people are like, well, of course it's not. Of course it's not. Women are just as good as men. Well, the history of the church has included a lot of statements to the contrary. In fact, church fathers talking about females as deformed males. Like, to be female has been seen in some eras of the church to be a disability.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we're imagining the ideal human, we're imagining a white, able-bodied, middle-class male.
Right.
Heterosexual. Like, there's this like certain, this is the default, and then everything else is kind of at a remove from this. And I just think it's really powerful to recognize God made men and women as his image, and the immediate command is to rule creation. And he doesn't. This would have been a wonderful time for him to step in and say, by the way, I'm not talking to the women anymore. I'm just talking to the men. The men are going to rule, and the women are going to make sandwiches. But he doesn't.
Or obey the men.
Right. He doesn't give us different tasks. He gives us the task of working side by side together. The first place in my reading of Genesis where we get hierarchy between men and women is in chapter 3 after the fall. And I don't think that that's the ideal that God is setting up for us to try to emulate or pattern our lives after. This is a result of the deformation of God's ideal. How about we lean into Genesis 1 and 2, where we're partners and working side by side to rule together?
Yeah. So speaking of that, you said leaning into Genesis 1 and 2. I wanted to kind of zoom in on some language that's in there. Yeah. I noticed that in the Genesis 2 narrative, there's a command that is given to the man to work and to keep. And then Genesis 1, we have the command given to male and female to rule and subdue. So that is a thing they both do together.
Yeah.
I'm curious, why is that distinction there? In what ways does that matter or not?
Yeah, so the second creation account in Genesis 2 is a slowing down and considering humanity and our role in a more intimate tone. Like, it's not, we're not seeing the cosmic order. We're looking at, okay, let's get down to brass tacks. let's see how this is going to work out. And so it's actually narrated in a different order. Genesis 2 has all sorts of potential contradictions with Genesis 1. If you're reading Genesis 1 as a blow by blow of the order in which God created things, then Genesis 2 causes problems because there's a person, but there's no shrubs and trees yet.
Right.
And it's like, wait, that's out of order. So a lot of people have wrestled with how do we fit these together? And I do talk about how I fit them together in the book. But I think the command to work and keep that God gives to the man is not for the man alone. He's at that point, he's still Adam, which later becomes a proper name. But at this point, it's not a proper name. It's just the human. So humans have been given the task to work and to keep. But one human by himself is not a good idea. And so right after giving him that command, God says, it's not good for the man to be alone. I need to make an azer kenegdo, a suitable ally for the work that I've given him to do. And of course, most English translations render that as helper, a helper suitable for him. And when we hear helper, we think of mommy's little helper,
right,
who is going to help clean up for lunch or something, or help set the table, but really mommy's the one doing the important work. And that is not the sense of the Hebrew word at all. The Hebrew word azer is a very strong word. It's only ever used of either God or military warriors, armies, elsewhere throughout the whole Old Testament. So this is the only place where it's used to describe a woman rather than being used to describe God or warriors. And there's never a place where it describes what a subordinate does for a master. So I don't think this has any hierarchy in it. This is just like Adam can't rely on the donkeys to really step up and help him do his job. He can't rely on the ostriches. He needs somebody like him who can come alongside and be an ally. And so he makes woman. So I don't see, so in making woman is automatically part of that task of working and keeping. That's how I would see it.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like I may have misspoke or spoke without precision earlier when I was saying like the task was given to the man. It was given to Adam, which in that context is humanity, humankind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of which there's only one on the scene. But that's partly the reason it's told that way is to introduce the need for companionship. This is not a one-man show. This is a group project. Yeah.
So speaking of that, I know that there is that one flesh reality, that group project that comes out at the end of Genesis 2. So how might we be able to distinguish what an individual image looks like and is supposed to do from a one flesh image of, the two halves of humanity almost coming together?
Sometimes people try to say the image is only corporate, so that we are all together as humanity, the image of God. But I think Genesis wants us to hold these two things together. Every human being is the image of God fully. We have bodies, we fully represent him, but the task we're given to do is a joint task that requires all of us to participate.
Yeah.
So there's an individual dignity, but there's also an ethical and practical outworking of that requires us to work together. Now, the end of chapter 2 does relate this to marriage in talking about Adam and Eve being one flesh. Like she's literally taken from his body. And so they share flesh. But I think it's important not to overplay that. There's a complementarity between male and female that is evident in the way their bodies fit together and the way they're going to be able, only with one of each, to procreate. And God does say, fill the earth and subdue it. And that's the only way to fill the earth is by making babies. And you need one man and one woman to do that.
Right.
However, making babies is not what makes them the image of God. They are the image of God already just by having human bodies. There's no other qualification of being God's image. Jesus in the New Testament is called by Paul the exact representation of God. He is the image of God, and Jesus never made any babies.
Yeah.
right? Like physically.
Or got married and made one
Right.
flesh.
He wasn't married and became, it
Mhm.
didn't become one flesh with one woman. And
Mhm.
so that tells me, no, you are fully the image of God. Even if you're single, it's not like you're walking around as half a person, and you really need to find your other half, and then you'll be whole. We are each whole people, and we are each the image of God. But the job we've been given to do as all humanity requires the participation of everyone. That does not mean we each need to make babies, but a whole lot of us need to, right? So I think that's an important distinction, because sometimes in Christian circles, singles are treated as less than fully human,
Right.
or less than fully grown up. Like they're just kind of their lives are on hold until they can find their other half.
Right.
And that's poppycock.
Yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
every human being, no matter their age or marital status, is the image of God and is whole and complete. And the partnership that God has designed for male and female to do far exceeds the task of making babies. There are lots of other things to do to keep and to work and keep the garden, to steward creation. You don't have to be married to someone to do that side by side as partners.
Well, that last statement you said leads into what's going to need to be our last question, just so I can respect your time. But I have, so you were talking about, like, there are lots of jobs that we can do. And I have heard from several scholars that the goal of humans was not to stay in the garden, but to kind of leave it and go out into the world to bring the rule of God into the rest of creation. Is that a view that you ascribe to, and what sort of evidence do you see of that in the text?
Yeah, my sense, and I first heard this from Greg Beale in his book, The Temple and the Church's Mission, and he persuaded me that Eden, the garden in Eden, was never meant to be just a closed thing. It was supposed to be expanding until it encompassed all of the earth. And I think probably the best evidence for that is, well, filling the earth and subduing it does imply them sort of moving out and stamping out chaos as they go. So I think it's already there from the very beginning. But it's super clear in John's vision in the book of Revelation. So Revelation 21:22, the new heavens and new earth come down as a city, the city of the New Jerusalem, and it's cubic. It's as wide as high as it is long. And the only other thing that's cubic in measurements in the Bible is the most holy place of the temple, which implies, and this is echoing what it says in the prophets, this implies that sacred space has expanded to now encompass everything. So you're either in God's creation and it's all sacred, or you're out. You're outside forever, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So one example, I think, is the end of Zechariah, where it says, even the bells on the horses will be holy.
Right.
And it will say, the Lord, is it the end of Ezekiel that says the Lord is there? There's this sense of like sacred space has now encompassed everything.
It also makes me think, like when you're talking about the end of Revelation, there is a picture of a river of living water that flows next to the tree, which connects to Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel 46 or 47. Sorry. But it also makes me think of Jesus in John's gospel when he talks about whoever believes in me, out of their belly will flow rivers of living water.
Yes.
Which connects back to Genesis and the picture of Eden as being this mountaintop garden with four rivers flowing out into the rest of creation.
Yeah, and what's striking about Ezekiel's vision of the river that's coming out, so in Ezekiel's vision, the river's coming out from under the altar at the temple.
Wow.
And it's flowing from the temple, and it's flowing toward the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because it's so dead, like it really is dead. There's not even microbacteria that live in the Dead Sea. There are no fish, there are no plants. It is dead because of the high mineral content. And you could stand on the banks of the Dead Sea, and you could pour water in it all day long, and you would never turn it into fresh water, because that's not how that works. But in Ezekiel's vision, the water that comes out from under the altar flows into the Dead Sea, and it brings it to life. And there are plants and there are animals. And so this is this idea of a life-giving expansion of sacred space that then we see picked up in the the vision that John has, where the river that's flowing from the throne of God has trees growing on either side, and it bears fruit every month, and the leaves are for the healing of the nations. I mean, it's this glorious kind of tying in all the threads of every biblical theological theme there is in the Bible.
Well, and what I think is really important, at least for me, to kind of flag there is that same commission to fill the earth and subdue it continues outside the garden. So it's not as if like that picture that we've been describing is only true on the, far edges of the Bible, before the fall and back in at the end in Revelation. It's like that's something we get to do now, today.
Yes.
So.
One of my favorite new discoveries is in Romans. There's this little comment that Paul makes at the end of his letter that I hadn't noticed before that is really fun. So speaking of connecting the middle with the beginning and end of the Bible. So you said that there's a fill the earth and subdue it. After the flood, God tells Noah and his descendants to fill the earth. Again, so they still have this commission. Let me find it. I think it's Romans 16, verse 20. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet.
Yep.
I love that one because I thought I had that figured out, that the snake crushing that was going to happen in response to Exodus or Genesis 3:15 was the birth of the Messiah who would crush Satan. But we have these other examples like Jael in the book of Judges, who crushes the enemy of God's people with a tent peg, crushes his head, and he falls at her feet. And it seems like that's a pretty clear allusion to Genesis 3. And then after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, Paul says the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet, which implies that we are the seed of the woman. Through our association with Jesus the Messiah, we are the seed of the woman who are continuing to fulfill our God-given vocation in the garden to fill the earth and subdue it. Subdue is a very violent word, kabosh, which means to kabosh, right? Like it's like, that's where we get the word in English. Like it's crushing the head of whatever exalts itself against God's rule. So I just think that's a fun little nugget.
Oh my gosh. This is stuff I can nerd out about all day.
Totally.
Just because it reminds me of Jesus sending the 70 out to the Decapolis when he says that you can stomp on scorpions and serpents.
Yes. And when they come back excited, he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So there he goes. So we get to participate. And that's, I think, pulling us back to this idea of being God's image. What does it mean? We are participants in the rule of God. We're not in charge ourselves. We have delegated authority, and we share it with every other human being, which is super cool.
To bring healing, to bring life, to the whole world, just like flowing into the Dead Sea. And that connects to me back to what you were saying about disabilities, where it's we have to, one of the things I tell my clients all the time is healing doesn't look the same for everybody. It looks very, very different for every body, literally every body. And so when we go out there and bring healing to the world, it's going to look different for every person, but it's always healing.
Every person has a role to play in this wider project. And the crushing that is happening, what's really fascinating to me, and I should have said this earlier, is there's no hierarchy, but it's not just about between male and female. Every human being is the image of God and is told to rule, but the thing we're told to rule over are the animals, not each other. There is no dominating each other or kiboshing each other that is even supposed to be happening. So I think for someone who's experienced trauma by the hand of someone connected with the church, right? Growing up in church and not being able to fit together what you're being told about God and what you're experiencing from people who call themselves Christians. Those things are not how it was meant to be.
Correct.
And God is not okay with it. And he's calling us to live differently. He's calling us into participation with a life-giving rule of God.
And now it's our job to go out there and do it.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Imes, for your time. I really appreciate it. It is incredibly valuable, and it's been a whole lot of fun to just discuss my favorite book with you. So thank you.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Spencer.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this discussion so we could be able to learn a little bit more about the things that we have been discussing in Genesis 1 and 2. My prayer is that this picture of the importance of our bodies to our identity, to recovery from trauma, and the value of both male and female in the image of God has helped reconstruct a picture of God and religion which doesn't hurt either your head or your heart. On YouTube and X, you can find me at ChurchKidPod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean, so you can find the HQ for all podcast content on churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started and get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give us a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give me any respect. And without those sweet, sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media at ChurchKidPod, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback and to improve where I can. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians 3:19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.